Recording in progress. So this was very much an unplanned component of my PhD, which I'll get into later. And I think it's going to be part of my PhD. I don't really know. What is my PhD about? They asked me that in all my supervisory meetings. We'll see if I ever find out. So this is about looking at impulsiveness as a personality trait in people and relating it to how they respond to surveys and how they maybe respond to purchases as well. So it's kind of hard for us to know, is this a survey-based problem or is it a life problem? And I guess that's something that we'll have to talk about at the end of this edit. And I guess the other part to say is that this is extremely preliminary, and I think the main thing I'm hoping to get out of this talk is feedback on where I might take this. So I'm pretty early on in digging into this. I'm just adding questions to random people's surveys and analyzing how it impacts their survey responses. And I have a lot of room where I could go with this potentially and maybe answer some of these unanswered questions that are popping up as I go forward. So happy to get some feedback on where you think I might take this. That's it thing. Here we go. Yeah, so generally speaking, the theme of my PhD research is all about quantitative psych and merging it with things that applied economists do. I think that it can offer us a lot of insights into the work we do. So preference formation is often likened into a black box. So we see these inputs of the attributes of these different choices that people make and maybe who the person is going to this black box, and it spits out what they chose. And economists are pretty good at measuring preferences. We're pretty good at understanding the trade-offs people make. We're pretty bad at understanding why, outside of saying, well, people don't like paying more. We often don't know, like, well, why do women respond differently than men? Or why do older people respond differently than younger people? We're pretty bad at that. And that's something that psychology can help us out with a lot by understanding more about how these demographic differences might exist in the population. So as I said, I'm just answering a few different methodological questions about quantitative psych issues by adding some questions inside the people's surveys. And this isn't so much of a methodological one, but it kind of starts scratching at some methodological issues or theoretical issues when it comes to our idea of valuation. So personality traits are being studied more and more as determinants of preferences in our choice experiment literature. So growing interest in understanding how personality impacts choices. And so typically when you look at these latent variable models, people are focused on really specific psychological traits more often than not. So you're looking at the likelihood of taking the bus. They'll measure, do people think that taking the bus is good? And they'll say people who think taking the bus is good, take the bus. And it's a massive insight. It's not actually that interesting. So more and more, we're getting into more generalized psychological traits of people. So the big 5 personality traits are most often studied, I'm finding. So these are agreeableness, neuroticism, extroversion, conscientiousness, openness. I think the reason why people study this is because it's called the big 5 personality traits. It's big, you notice it. We're getting less attention to other personality traits. So impulsiveness is a personality trait that I think is probably going to be pretty crucial to understanding how people make economic choices. And it hasn't really been studied much. So I found one paper that looked at this, and it was a methodological paper looking at some of these integrated, like hybrid attitudinal choice models. And they said, let's look at impulsiveness and see if it impacts choices. And they said, oh yeah, impulsive people don't pick the status quo. That's neat. And moved on. And they're like, but mostly the model works. And they didn't really care about the impulsiveness, which is interesting. So first, we have to think about what impulsiveness is. I think we all have an idea in our head, but when I dug into the psych literature and measurements of impulsiveness, it was a bit different than I thought. So there's 2 components to this really technical definition on the board. The first one, the first line is it's essentially people are thinking without acting. So they're making really quick judgments. Acting without thinking, not thinking without, that's a good one. Acting without thinking. So they are making a decision without thinking about it much or at all. The second component is they're putting way less emphasis on costs or negative consequences. So we're telling people, please weigh the benefits and the costs of this choice and decide whether it's a worthwhile thing for you to do. And some people are saying, no, or I won't really think about it that much. And they're saying, well, I'll think about it, but I'm going to ignore the cost part. I'm just going to focus on the benefits and disregard the costs. So you kind of see where we're going with this. This is maybe going to be problematic for a lot of economic valuation studies if we have people who A, aren't willing to put a lot of effort into making decisions, or B, are going to put some effort in, but might disregard the cost side of the decision. So impulsiveness is very widely studied across psychology for many good reasons. So first, it's a personality trait that is studied. So there's variation across the population. Within this room, some people are going to be very impulsive, some people are going to be very unimpulsive. And it kind of helps us understand a lot of different impacts in their life of, you know, are you going to go home and buy a $200 bottle of wine at the liquor store on the way home? Or are you going to keep putting money into your savings over and over again and avoid spending? That's one thing we could look at. It's also really widely examined in research and clinical applications as well, though. So it's a component or symptom of a lot of different disorders, ADHD, bipolar disorder. Sometimes people get brain injuries, and it's a big symptom of certain specific types of brain injuries. And it has a lot of strong links to undesirable, irrational, harmful, or counterproductive behavior. So violence and aggression, substance abuse, pathological gambling. So we find that people with addictions have higher levels of impulsiveness than people who don't have addictions. People who are in jail are more impulsive than people who aren't in jail. All these different relationships are holding true, where we find that people who make decisions that are typically socially undesirable or might actually make themselves worse off tend to be more impulsive. So if we're tying this into economics and applied economics and surveys, if you think about discrete choice experiments, it's a good place to start because one, we're doing a survey already, so we can measure their level of impulsiveness. So we're going to show people a choice experiment table. This is an example from Claire's recent survey, and I'm using her example instead of mine because she hired an artist to make her pictures. I created my art in PowerPoint. This is much nicer to look at for a prolonged period of time. So we show people these two states of the world, and we say, we want you to be really careful. We want you to imagine this is actually happening. So in this case, we're saying this is an average neighborhood park on the left, give or take. And we want to know if your park were changed to look like the one on the right, would you be happy? Which of the two would you prefer? So looking at this, we're saying, well, you're going to lose half of your grass. So you're going to have less room for sports, less room for your kids to run around. Everything else is going to stay the same. So we're going to have more native vegetation instead of grass, and your tax rates are actually going to go down a bit. So between these two, what would you choose? So before we do a choice experiment, we have a long list of things that we often tell people. This is guided by different recommendations on, how to limit hypothetical bias, how to maximize incentive compatibility. So really what we want to do is make sure that when people are responding to a question like that, they're going to do what makes them best off, and they're going to do what they would actually do if this was a real life situation. So we're going to often give them cheap talk scripts. So we're going to say, please look at that cost. So if your taxes went up, please actually think, like, would you be happy if your taxes went up? Would you be willing to trade off that income for these gains in your park? Can you actually even afford it? Please be really careful to think about this. Like, we know money's not changing hands here, but we really want you to think that money is actually changing hands here. And we want you to really carefully look at this table and look at every single attribute and really compare the two and think about what's going to make you better off. So the traits that define impulsive people is essentially a checklist of the things we're asking people not to do, saying, please make a careful decision. And they're saying, I don't make careful decisions. Like, please carefully consider the two options. Like, I don't do that. Like, please really focus on the cost. I'm like, I struggle to focus on the cost. So of course, this is maybe going to lead to increased error variance. It might lead to inflated willingness to pay. It's kind of hard to say, but we know that impulsive responses are thought to be undesirable. So if people are just making snap judgments, not thinking carefully, it's probably not what we wanted with the exercise. And in the one paper that looked at impulsiveness as a personality trait, they did find, again, that people were tending to pick the other alternative that wasn't the status quo. So essentially, people were picking the alternative that led to an improvement, but also had a cost attached to it. So it's hard to tell what's going on here. Is it just that they're picking at random and less people just happen to be picking that other alternative, so they're just kind of moving towards the mean? Is it that they're insensitive to cost? Is it that they like something new? It's kind of hard to disentangle. And that's what I'm trying to look at with this research. So does impulsiveness impact survey responses? And I mean, yes, I'm here. I guess I set it up as a question in the first slide, but I wouldn't be talking about it if it had no impact. So more specifically, does impulsiveness just make people choose alternatives at random? Or does impulsiveness make people less responsive to costs? Or does it just make them choose the new thing? And either way, so there's a few different questions here too. Is this the other big question that's not on the board, so I can't answer it, is this a hypothetical bias problem? Or is this a problem that happens in real world scenarios too? Are impulsive people always going to spend more than unimpulsive people, even if they're income constrained? And there is evidence of that where, they'll max out, highly impulsive people will max out lots of loans and credit cards and eventually will become financially constrained, but do tend to spend more than they make often. So it's possible that this is going to be a problem in revealed preference studies too. But what does that say about our idea of value? So if people aren't considering the costs when they're weighing the benefits and the costs, if they're maybe making decisions that make themselves worse off, is that purchase price a factor, or is that a component of economic value if they're actually making decisions that lead them to a worse situation? I'm not too sure. That's something we need to think about. So in order to do this, we have to measure impulsiveness. And there's a really good scale for this. So it's been in use for over 60 years, Barrett's impulsiveness scale. And this thing has been tested repeatedly. We're currently on the 11th edition of this. And so as I said before, it's used across all sorts of settings. So in general populations, research studies like at universities, but it's also one of those questionnaires that they might have at hospitals, psychiatric clinics, and psychologist's office, just to help diagnose different disorders and understand kind of different circumstances that people are in. So there's a bit of debate over how this scale works, whether is impulsiveness one trait, one factor that exists within a person, or is it kind of multifaceted? So the three most mentioned factors or subcomponents of impulsiveness are motor, attentional, and non-planning. So motor impulsiveness is this idea that people just act without thinking. Attentional is that people have trouble focusing in on tasks, and non-planning is that there's a lack of forethought for the future. So I'm just going to quickly show the full scale. So the full scale is 30 items long. It's very long, asking people about what they do. So do you plan tasks carefully? Do you change jobs frequently? Do you like thinking about complex problems? Do you like doing puzzles? Pretty all over the place. And if you want to group them into some of these subcategories, so we have motor impulsivity, again, it's all about acting without thinking. Attentional, again, lack of concentration and non-planning. So you see how those items all group in nicely as how you might conceptualize those different subdomains of impulsiveness. And so in this case, I'm focusing in on motor impulsive people. And the reason why isn't because I thought that this was more relevant to choice experiments per se, which it actually might be, but it was because when I started this study, it had the strongest link to risk preferences in the risk literature. So when I started this out, it was for a project on Perth residents' willingness to pay to mitigate natural disaster risk. And I thought, well, risk preferences are going to be a really good determinant of this probably. So people who are risk seekers are probably not going to want to pay as much money to reduce risks. Makes sense. And I thought, well, there's all these different ways of measuring risk preferences. I'm going to measure a few other variables that I know are highly correlated with risk preferences. I'm going to try to figure out which measure of risk preference is the best one. So impulsiveness was one of the things I included in the survey, as well as other funny variables like disinhibition. I asked how tall people are. So taller people take more risks because they have less fear of doing dumb stuff. I don't know. It held true in my data as well. So I focus in on motor impulsivity for that reason in the study, but I think it makes sense to broaden it beyond motor impulsiveness. And actually what I found with that, so that's what started this research off, was that impulsive people are risk seekers. So risk seekers probably want to spend less money on reducing risks. Then I found impulsive people wanted to spend more money. I thought that doesn't make any sense. That's why I started adding it to other surveys. It's just like a weird p-value fluke thing. So now I brought it into 3 surveys. I'm presenting results of 2 today. So I got 2 case studies. I got the earthquake one that I mentioned before, about 1,000 people from Perth. And we're looking at their willingness to pay to reduce the risk of losing heritage buildings in York, as well as a few other community impacts there. So the unique angle here is, again, impulsive people should be willing to pay less to reduce risks because they're also risk takers. And I've also got Claire's choice experiment that just came back. So this is looking at willingness to pay, willingness to accept for changes to their local park. And the unique angle here is that I've got a deviation. So the baseline is that, taxes go up every year. So senior taxes are going up, but they might go up less. So it's cost isn't strictly correlated with the SQ, with the status quo in this case. So I've got cost can go up or down. So it kind of helps explain, are people just choosing a new thing because it's new, or are people choosing a new thing because they ignore costs, or are people choosing a new thing because they're just choosing things at random? So it kind of helps us get at those three different hypotheses of what's happening here. So the York case study, here's some old buildings in York because my slides are white and I have no pictures. And here is a gigantic choice experiment table just showing you how this works. We showed people predicted damages that might happen under a few different earthquake scenarios in York. So how many heritage buildings might get destroyed, length of power outage, and how many people might suffer from mental well-being consequences after an earthquake passes through, and how much it's going to cost the household. And back to the park example, we've got, so 2 parks, and the ground cover in the park is going to change, the amount of trees is going to change, and the council rates are going to change. And there's a picture, so Claire hired a landscape architect designer to make 60 of these accurate representative pictures of the different choice sets to help communicate this to people rather than making them focus in on these percentage descriptions. So methods, keeping it simple for now. So I'm just estimating impulsiveness as like the factor score of my different impulsiveness items, rather than going into the fancy hybrid modeling world for now. So that's going to be kind of the end game. So it's kind of like the workhorse exploration time. And once I get to a close end model, I'm going to transition in there. I've had a few funny results coming through with that too, but some of these models, they take a day to converge. So it's easier to work in the factor score world and have a model converge in 5 seconds and see what's actually going on with the data. So the earthquake data, I'm going to be estimating some conditional logit models where I'm going to interact impulsiveness with the status quo of the tax. So basically saying, are impulsive people less or more responsive to tax increases, and are impulsive people more or less likely to choose the status quo? And the park data, similar, using probit models, just because data has, so the second thing with earthquake data is our heteroscedastic conditional logit. So looking at, does impulsiveness increase randomness of people's responses? So saying, do impulsive people have a higher error variance in our model? So do we have less of an idea of what they're actually doing? So if people are just picking at random, we're expecting that we're going to have more error in those impulsive people. So park data, probit models, because data has a nice probit function built in, and looking at general probit models with interactions with impulsiveness with the status quo and tax again. So looking again, do impulsive people check the status quo? Are they less or more responsive to tax? And then does impulsiveness drive increased error variance in the sample? I'm also just going to quickly, just to help explain this a bit more, I also looked at respondent characteristics and how they relate to impulsiveness. So I just did a quick SEM model relating impulsiveness to these different items that I've got measured. And it's the causal structure is wrong, but I just wanted to know, are impulsive people responding to the survey way faster? Are they racing through the survey really quick? We asked people in the survey, did you ignore the cost in the choice experiments? I want to know, did they just say I ignored the cost? Did you think about how much you could afford? I want to know if they told us, yeah, I thought about it or not. I want to know where these correlations all lie.
Does that mean you actually measure the response time as well?
Mm-hmm.
So you know how many seconds?
I don't know I didn't measure it for the choice questions, but I know for the whole survey, which is actually still helpful. So it would be nicer if I had it for the choice questions within reason, but the whole survey is a decent indicator too of how quickly people were racing. So as you will see how quickly people raced. So as a quick breakdown of this, so older people are less impulsive. This isn't too surprising. More educated people are less impulsive. This isn't too surprising, especially knowing that example that I showed of how personality studies are used. We find that less impulsive people perform better academically. So Impulsive people are less likely to be protest voters. So a protest voter is when someone picks the status quo alternative in our choice experiment every single time. And then afterwards we say, why did you do it? And they say, I don't think the government's going to do what they said they did, or I don't think that, this problem is even real. So they're not really responding to the choice experiment or the trade-off between attributes. They're just disagreeing with the practice altogether. So protesters, less impulsive. There's a couple of reasons this might be. If people are truly picking at random, it's going to be really unlikely they pick the status quo alternative every single time. So that could be one driver. The other driver is, again, that you're more likely to pick the status quo if it's the non-cost alternative, if you are non-impulsive. So if you're impulsive, you don't care about costs, there's no reason to pick the status quo every time. And we'll also see that, so people who completed, this is the earthquake survey, that was a survey that easily should have taken 15 minutes. So people who completed it in under 4 minutes are way more impulsive. People who did it in 4 to 8 minutes are way more impulsive, and we see it slowly dropping off. Yeah.
It might not be impulsive, it might be just doing it for the money. Because there's a group of people who do it from,
Yeah.
they've got the link, they're doing it from Korea, they're picking up a bit of money.
No, exactly. I think that's what a lot of, I think that's a whole other question of like these survey responses and validity of online panels is how accurate are responses. And because I think a lot of people are doing it for the money, and that's why you're, for this survey, a 50-minute survey, you're probably getting paid under $1. So why would you have an incentive to spend 20 minutes for $1 when you could do 4 minutes for $1? So that's a good point. But I think still the correlation between impulsiveness and time is there. So I think some people are going to be fast and unimpulsive, and some people are going to be fast and impulsive. It's possible that some of that correlation might be spurious. It might be that fast people click strongly agree to all the impulsiveness questions without thinking. It's kind of hard to say, but that's a good point. The other thing just to bring up on this slide is that, so impulsive people said they considered cost and the budget. So impulsive people said, I looked at the cost and I thought about it, and I thought about whether I could afford it in the choice experiment. So it's good to know that they said that they looked at that. But if we start looking at these model results, so first, this is the earthquake survey. So our first one, we're just looking at an interaction between the status quo and impulsiveness. And we're seeing impulsive people don't pick the status quo as often. They're more likely to pick the other alternative. And so if I try an interaction with tax instead, I find, well, they're less responsive to tax. So see tax as a negative coefficient. So as tax goes up, less people pick it. But if you're impulsive, you're a bit less responsive to tax. But it seems as though the status quo model is fitting it better. So if I put them both in, status quo is significant, tax is insignificant. So if I think about the idea that maybe it is driving heteroscedasticity, so people are just selecting options at random, they're not thinking about it. Well, it's not very significant, and I've left all the other interactions out of the model. So it's possible there's a bit more error going on, but if I add that status quo impulsiveness interaction back in, that heteroscedasticity component is now insignificant again. So it seems as though really impulsive people have an aversion to the status quo, which is also an aversion to the non-cost option. So in this case, status quo and tax are so highly negatively correlated, it's hard to tell exactly what's going on. And last, I just quickly looked at time heterogeneity, because I was looking at that in conjunction with all the impulsiveness stuff and found that time heterogeneity or heteroscedasticity was a really big driver of that increased error variance. So I found really fast people answered a lot more randomly, as well as really slow people. So it seems like maybe people who struggled with the survey content were kind of picking at random, and people who were speeding through were picking at random a bit more as well. And overall, so it looks like our best models here are the ones where impulsiveness is interactive with the status quo. So it seems like impulsive people less likely to select the status quo. So they're less likely to be protest responders, less likely to select the status quo. They don't seem to just be making random decisions. And so just for reference in the tax interaction models, if you could look at the impact of impulsiveness on responsiveness to tax, we're finding with every standard deviation movement along the impulsiveness scale, people are 13% less responsive to tax. So if you're starting at the mean, if you move out the standard deviation, willingness to pay goes up, by 13%. If you go up to willingness to pay goes up 26%. If you go down to standard deviations, willingness to pay goes down 26%. So quite a bit of variance in willingness to pay explained by impulsiveness. So moving to the PARC data, this is just binary probit models. So first, just looking at the impact of impulsiveness. So in this case, this is akin to an interaction of impulsiveness with the new alternative that's not the status quo. So we find if we're just looking at that, impulsive people are more likely to take up the option that is the new alternative. And remember in this case too, tax is not linked to the status quo, or is not negatively linked to the status quo anymore. So taxes can go up or down and people are actually choosing the new alternative. But if I look at this with an interaction on tax, I find that the tax interaction actually explains the data a bit better. So it seems as though people are actually just less responsive to taxes. So people who are more impulsive, less responsive to taxes, so they're more willing to take that an option that has the tax go up. And if I put both effects in at the same time, you can see again, so the tax effect seems stronger. So this suggests that impulsive people, when weighing the benefits and the costs, they're putting less emphasis on the costs. And this gets a bit stronger. So in this case, since we had tax increases and decreases, I split the tax variable up into two variables. So I have it ranges from 0 to 200. You remember the status quo alternative has a $200 tax increase. So I have like the tax decrease amount, that variable just ranges from 0 to 200. So if the tax was below that threshold, it's in that category. And if it's from 200 to 400, I have a continuous variable for if it was an increase. So we'd expect, if we think about loss aversion, we're going to expect people to be more responsive to tax increases than tax decreases. And that's what we find. So we find that as taxes go up, we see this negative 0.005. People are less likely to choose the option, whereas if it's a tax decrease, they're a bit less responsive. And with our impulsiveness interactions here, we find that impulsive people are less responsive to a tax increase, but they're equally responsive to a tax decrease. So this might lend support to this idea that impulsive people are actually just not giving full weight to the cost. So it's not that they're unresponsive to money, it's that they're unresponsive to their taxes going up, but they're equally as responsive to their taxes going down. So that's an interesting one. And now if we look at heteroscedasticity of this one, we actually do find a bit more heteroscedasticities driven by this impulsiveness variable. So impulsive people are picking at random a bit more than unimpulsive people. I tested with the time variables as well, and it's still held. And you can see it adjusts the other factors a bit. So it decreases the cost non-responsiveness a bit, but that effect is still there. And in this case, I also just ran a quick mixed or random parameter model as well. So I didn't do that with the others just because, again, having an SQ random parameter in the last model, status quo is so heavily linked with tax that once I put that in, it kind of controls for a lot of this underlying variation. So I think that's something I need to start investigating once I get into the hybrid modeling world, where I can maybe have a random parameter for impulsiveness and a random parameter for the status quo and allow those to be correlated and see if I can dig that effect out a bit better. But in this case, since that correlation is not there, this effect still holds when I add in the random parameter too. So tying these results up together, impulsive people seem like they might be, well, they are less likely to choose the status quo if we're not controlling for the tax effect. They are selecting responses more randomly than unimpulsive people, but it also seems like they're maybe less responsive to tax increases. So no difference for a tax decrease, but more responsive to a tax decrease, or increase. So that's evidence here that impulsive people are just less likely to consider the cost. When they're weighing the costs and benefits of these two different options before them, they're focused on the benefits and ignoring the costs. It seems likely with this data set. And again, so just for reference, looking at these impulse tax interactions and cost unresponsiveness, same level of impact in the earthquake study. So for each standard deviation I went up on that impulsiveness scale, people were 13% less responsive to cost. And when I did that for the decrease variable too, even though the tax decrease interaction was insignificant, it was a 13% less responsive effect to that cost. So it might just be the case that because everything was scaled down, didn't have enough data to differentiate it being different from zero, but all interactions involving tax, I'm finding that as you go up one standard deviation, a person is 13% less responsive to money. So good consistency. So next steps with where I need to take this, more data, more repetitions of this. So we're getting some data back on species and biodiversity with Michael and Ram. I've added a few questions in there, been running some preliminary models. And so maybe room for, inconsistent and confusing results. Michael and I have been emailing things back and forth, trying to figure out what's going on. This is a tricky one since they've got 3 different versions of the survey. You hope that the same thing happens all 3 times, and it doesn't seem to be happening. So we'll have to figure out what's going on. I need to get into this hybrid choice modeling world to fully represent these latent variables properly. But again, that's going to be a later step. And I need to do some more testing with the broader BIS scale. So look at these other dimensions of impulsiveness and how they relate to choices. And so I think this kind of opens up a few new things that I'm curious about too. So this first one I've just been thinking about this morning. But I'm thinking about endogeneity within my own survey. So I'm thinking, are people speeding through a survey? Because these impulsiveness questions are coming at the end. Are they thinking without acting for 5-10 minutes? And then I say, do you think without acting? And I'm wondering if they're being primed by speeding through a survey. And maybe they're not this impulsiveness all the time, but they are in the survey context. So I'm kind of curious, what happens if I put this at the start of the survey? And thinking about all these DCE things about, asking people to take vows, to take the choice experiment seriously. Would this be a similar tool? I wonder if you showed people, we want you to take this seriously, carefully consider the options, really pay attention to the cost. I wonder if you put the scale right before a choice experiment, would it prime people to think about whether they do that? Would it prime people to take it more seriously? And I'm not sure, but I'm kind of curious to know now, if we ordered it differently, would we see different correlations or different willingness to pay? The next big question is, how does impulsivity impact real behavior? So this might be a hypothetical problem, but it seems likely that it could also be a real problem. So I'm wondering, is this extra inflated in the hypothetical scenario? I don't know, and this is probably going to need some lab experiments more than anything else, because it's hard to get real purchasing data combined with psychometrics, especially the psychometric that you really need. And I think the last one is just really, so if this is a problem, if this is inflating willingness to pay estimates, if this is inflating error, it's kind of hard to make this judgment call of how impulsive is too impulsive. How do we weight different respondents? Do we need to exclude people from the model? And that's where I start getting uncomfortable and I don't know what to do. It's more, this is an interesting study in understanding hypothetical bias. The way I'm thinking about this in my head is, it seems like maybe if you are a more impulsive person, you have a higher chance of making an irrational decision or making a decision that makes you worse off, but it's not to say every decision you make is a bad one. So it's hard to figure out that relationship. So just closing brief summary. What did I do? What did I talk about? I'm finding that impulsiveness is linked to an aversion to selecting the status quo, that impulsiveness is linked to less consideration of cost and choice experiments, and that it's linked to an increased error variance when we're modeling preferences. So there's a bit of random selection going on, there's a bit of status quo aversion, and there's a bit of unresponsiveness to cost. So I'm starting to dig into this deeper, but still it's a bit unclear what's happening. And it could result in inflated WTP estimates and less reliable measures of preferences at the end of the day. So it's all important to disentangle and keep this going forward. So that's that, and happy to answer some questions.
Most interested in the second question you raised for future research, the hypothetical bias question, because if you think of a real situation, we have the market counterparts of whatever scenario. We have a market, products, services. When people making choice, they could weigh cost and benefit in real situation. You can consider all the cost and benefit, making very prudent and careful choices. But when in this survey, hypothetical, they don't have that binding thing. And then I can finally have a chance to ignore the cost. Anything you propose, premium products, you have all these control upfront, minimizing hypothetical bias, but still it's hypothetical. I don't have to give you money, right? That's still there. Impulsiveness is supposed to be something intrinsic, right? In real situation, in hypothetical, there's always that. But that could be, and to what extent this impulsivity is more salient in hypothetical situation. If you can unpack that, you address a very big issue.
Yeah.
And in many surveys, you find, okay, the hypothetical survey results, when you have market counterparts, high response rate than market penetration. And that's a question plagued the literature a long time, right? And then you don't have, if you can unpack that, that's a big solution.
Yeah.
And I just don't, because otherwise people still think about this, how much this just simply reflect the hypothetical bias and how are they related to each other? And that's I think that's a big issue.
No, I agree. And I think that's one thing I've been thinking about a lot. So talking about hypothetical and revealed preferences and biases and everything, I think I have a hunch that this is a bigger problem in hypothetical situations, that impulsive people do have limits and bounds in real life. But I guess it's hard to say because unimpulsive people answering the survey also don't have that binding cost. So it's hard to tell. Is it a linear shift up, or is it a parallel? Are the lines running parallel to each other, or is the hypothetical bias line for impulsiveness steeper than for less impulsive people? And I don't know. So that is an important thing to unpack. Yeah.
So I'm wondering whether there's sort of a useful economic definition of impulsiveness, that it's spending more than you can reasonably afford.
Yeah.
And so I see, my informal definition. You see compulsive behavior around cars and handbags and shoes. I'm always buying handbags. So I wonder if you could have some questions in there, about credit card debts or scenarios around you really, there's a car going really cheaply or something like that you can't really afford. What you do, because when it comes to something like biodiversity, it's so abstract, or even earthquake risk in somewhere that you don't live. It's so abstract. I can't quite see how it doesn't look like a convertible or a handbag. So and I just wonder whether there's some actually more real economic questions you could ask about people's attitude to gambling, because gambling is another area where you see impulsive behavior gets people into trouble.
Mm-hmm.
But then there's also other impulsive behavior that isn't to do with economics and might be about other things, about risk taking that doesn't have a monetary outcome.
Yeah, I know.
But I'm thinking, actually, I wonder if this is where you actually need to do an experiment rather than a choice experiment.
That's what I think.
Get people into the lab and
exactly.
use the psychologist's approach.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think an experiment is definitely needed to unpack this. There, and
I just wanted to follow up on what Ben just said. You mentioned gambling.
Yeah.
For a long time in the past, people could not understand why people gambling the way they gamble. Just didn't make economic sense and so on. Until it appeared that the utility function included the act of gambling itself, irrespective of what the expected gains were.
Yeah.
Now, I know there's some studies, first of all, about spending more than you can. That is a long-term thing, but impulsiveness is a short-term thing. It's about, it's in the minutes and so on. And in my family, I had some pretty serious people doing that. So linking with the gambling behavior, there would be direct utility. If in buying something, shoes, or in the act of buying, in the act of choosing, in the act of being in the shop, or whatever it is, right? And it's got nothing to do with the with the item.
Exactly. Yeah. I think that's one thing that was one of the first thoughts I had too when I was looking at different psychological definitions of impulsiveness, is that it is all about the act of acting. It has nothing to do with the good. It's really just like the short-term high of getting the thing and doing making the decision, and then maybe it is actually long-term, it results in regret. Maybe even an hour later results in regret, and you're worse off than you were before. So it's an interesting challenge to the notion of value and welfare. And yeah.
You might be able to, if you're going to experiment, and we can think a bit about this, the situation, how the level of urgency of the situation. So how much time do you have to make a decision? Is that a factor or not? Doesn't that interact with impulsiveness? Do impulsive and non-impulsive people react differently to emergency situations or situations?
So
That's a good one.
with time, if you give a non-impulsive person less time, they might appear to be impulsive.
Yeah, like making them answer a survey for 70 cents. Like self-imposed time limits. Yeah. So
how many of your respondents, since you ran the EIS, would you say were rather impulsive? What are we talking about? What's the scale of the problem?
Few. Yeah, so people were relatively unimpulsive. And I think there's a lot to unpack there too about social desirability bias. If we socially think impulsiveness is bad, and who wants to admit to being that socially bad. But it was, the mean was below the median, like the middle point on the scale. So I think almost everyone relatively said, I disagree. So on the 5-point scale, they were a 2 on almost every question. So a few people actually admitted to being highly impulsive, but it was mostly below the midpoint. But we still found that variation between even like 1s, 2s, and 3s. We still saw a lot of variation there. So
maybe you should go and sit in on counseling psychologists.
I know. Yeah. Let's go back.
Can I just
Yeah.
a quick clarifying question?
Yeah.
Did you use all those 30?
No, I did it. So that was why I had to, space constraints, I had to focus in on just a few motor impulsiveness questions. So that's definitely something that needs to be
How
done.
many statements was that?
It depended on the survey, but there were between 3 and 6, depending on the application. And so that's what I need to do next too, is if I do the full survey, look at how well does the 3-statement and 6-statement version relate to the 30-statement version, or the 10-item subdomain of motor impulsiveness. All of those different things I think are important to do. Like this was really just a quick exercise in how is Ethel and Grossman and Holt and Laurie doing at measuring risk preferences, and now it's kind of turned into this instead. So it's
We have 2 questions here, and then 1 question here. Do you want to go next?
Oh, sorry. Steve's last question was my question. So you're
go.
So I think the issue about the 3 questions and the ordering, I reckon you could put the 3 that you put for hours. Could go at the front. But then I think you could frame those questions again about the choice set. As in you could ask those exactly those 3 questions, but say referencing the choice set to see whether that's mapping up, to see whether or not they are giving you the same response. I mean, very impulsive when I go and buy shoes, but when I did your choice set.
That's smart.
And then I'm like, well, you're heading into a can of worms or over a precipice or something. The moment you start saying that there's a problem in the sense of saying, well, but you shouldn't be doing that.
I know.
So I'm not saying that you shouldn't be doing it, but as in that's just a question about saying, okay, I'm going to ignore your utility functions. You've said that you genuinely like this handbag and you've gone out and got all this pleasure from it. And I'm going to tell you that actually that really didn't make you happy. So I think at that point it's
that's where it gets really tricky of like, when you tell people that they made us like, who's to say that people are making decisions that make them worse off from the outside? And it's interesting when you read the psych literature, it's like a given. It's like impulsiveness, bad. Impulsive people make decisions that make themselves worse. I guess it's not even like, I'm assuming there's some old research where they've like verified this, but now it's just impulsiveness. It's a bad thing. People make bad decisions because of it. And it's just no debate.
But regret is an interesting thing because as in, do you always assume that the last point of time is the correct point to measure my utility? So I've done good things and I regret them. Okay, does that mean I dismiss all the happiness I got before I did the good things? So I regret it?
No, I know that's hard. The timing of like when you measure utility, and I would argue in a lot of these policy cases, like policy is not an impulsive process. So if you're trying to figure out, do you support this new biodiversity program? You probably don't want to measure it 10 seconds after they learn about it. You probably want to measure it, maybe give them time to digest it. So that's another thing with these surveys where we're introducing new ideas to people. Do you just hammer them with information, make them make a choice right on the spot and say, that's your preference? and you wanted your taxes to go up by $1,000. Like, I don't know. So
Forcing them to be impulsive.
yeah, we are forcing people to be impulsive in the survey. So, yeah. Ken, yes.
Is the take home message that the personality profile in your sample group should be the same as the population, then your problems avoided?
It's hard to tell. I think that's where it gets complicated. Is everyone just normal? Maybe. And I think it's almost this last point on the bottom of, as impulsiveness increases, maybe the odds of making a choice that's not actually representing true preferences increases, or maybe it's a true preference in the moment, but it actually leads to a worse situation. That's what I'm still trying to figure out. Like, I would feel more comfortable if it didn't have such a big impact on willingness to pay and responsiveness to cost. That, yeah,
That reflects the true situation.
it represents the true situation, but does the true situation represent economic value accurately? I think is the bigger question of that. So if this is representing the true situation, which I think there might be hypothetical bias involved, that's one thing. And then the next part is, if this is true, are more impulsive decisions representative of value, or is it representative of, again, the action as opposed to the good? So again, is a handbag worth $1,000, or was it you got a big surge of dopamine when you bought the handbag, and then 5 hours later you feel bad about yourself? Like, I don't, and then that's where it gets tricky.
Two questions of separating out personality and values.
Exactly.
The boundaries, not fix the rule.
Exactly. So it's more, I think, and I can't make that
Depends
judgment.
on whether you're interested in people's willingness to pay or the value of the good.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So,
Could go both ways, 5 hours later or 5 days later, having bought the bag could be either positive or negative.
yeah,
And if it's positive, then you have complicated psychological
Yeah.
forces coming in of self-justification.
exactly. That's the next part. Yeah.
Right? So
Yeah.
you don't want to admit that it was a bad, so you find
Yeah.
all sorts of reasons to persuade yourself that it was a good choice.
No, exactly. Confirmation bias.
But the
Everything.
psychologists are good for that.
Yeah.
Question from Faye, from Zoom.
Cool.
I wonder if impulsiveness is related to the type of question issue one is considering. Thinking of Kahneman's due system theory, thinking fast versus thinking slow. Do you observe that in your study? You have time.
Yeah, I have time. I don't have time of each choice, and I haven't read the Kahneman Thinking Fast, Thinking Slow. So I'm not, but I think that is an yeah. I think this maybe links back to people saying, like, are we forcing people to be impulsive? Are we forcing people to make fast decisions or thoughtful decisions? And I mean, it's interesting looking at impulsive decisions in this survey versus Hanley did a cool study where the in-person choice experiment, the enumerator rated whether choices that were made were impulsive or not. And they found very few choices were impulsive, I think under 10% in their survey, whereas I think in this one, it seems like it's quite high when you look at, 15% of the people did the survey in under 7 minutes, and they probably couldn't have actually done that. So, yeah.
Questions? No more questions?
Let the class end.
Just real quick, did you find any relationship with outlying data? So are outliers?
Indeed.
Yep.
Can we continue that discussion after this?
Sure, sure.
All right, we're out. Thanks for coming, everybody.
Well, if the number of questions is a measure of interest, then there were a lot of questions.